Welcome to the Agile Wire, where professional Scrum trainers Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky discuss Agile topics. Now, here are your hosts, Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky.
And we are recording. All right, Mr. Boobles, kick us off, man.
All right, so we got Josh Seiden joining us on the podcast. So probably don't even need to introduce Josh because he's written a number of Agile books out there. Not even Agile books, just great books out there. So he's got Outcomes Over Outputs is the latest one, Sense and Respond, and then LeanUX. That one I saw like a million versions out when I was Googling you today, Josh, to for the intro. I was like, how many language versions do you have now of that one? It looked like there was just a ton of them when I looked on Amazon.
Yeah, I think it's been translated into 10 languages.
Okay.
I just got last month. I just got the recent translation into Portuguese, which was pretty cool. And I made a note to myself. I have to count how many translations. So,
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So you wrote those other two books. So why did you write the latest one, Outcomes Over Outputs, which still is, it's somewhat new, I guess, yet. So
yeah.
Why write that after you read the other two books?
So it's interesting, so LeanUX, which was the first book, and so I wrote that with my co-author and colleague, Jeff Gothelf. Mm-hmm. And so that book came out, the first edition came out in 2012. And so we were both very influenced. We both come from a sort of the UX world, and we were both very influenced by Lean Startup. And one of the sort of ideas that we were really interested in was this idea of being less focused on the deliverable, right? Traditionally, UX, when you kind of come up in UX, and certainly back then, a lot of the conversation in the UX world is about making great deliverables, which, okay, whatever. And so that book was really about, it was based on an article that Jeff wrote called Getting Out of the Deliverables Business. And the idea was it doesn't matter if your UX deliverables are great or if they're terrible, right? What matters is how well that helps the team move forward to deliver a great product. And so that was really kind of in the sort of infancy, this idea of outcomes. And you hear a lot of talk about that in the sort of lean startup world and certainly in the Agile world. And as we revised the book, the second edition, we kind of leaned into this idea of outcomes, but it never felt really crisp and precise to me. It was like, well, we all kind of know what an outcome is. It's a result, right? Mm-hmm. And so as the more we taught it, the material, and I spent a lot of time teaching that material, the more I taught it, the more I was looking for good ways to both understand it and explain it. And so when sort of in teaching this with Jeff, this sort of idea came up, that an outcome is a very specific measurable change in behavior that generates value, right? That's the definition that I use in the book. I thought okay, this is a good topic for a small book. And so that was really kind of the motivation there.
Okay. So, help us. Let's dive a little bit deeper into outcomes because people struggle with that all the time. So,
yeah,
when we say outcome, are we saying it has to be a customer or user behavior result that we're looking for? Is that really the essence of it, or am I missing something there?
Well, that's really interesting, right? It's a change in human behavior that creates value. Okay, so who's the human, right? And what's really interesting about that definition is if it's something that someone on my team is doing differently and it's valuable, that's an outcome. If it's something that the business's customers are doing differently, that's an outcome. If it's creating value for the customer and for the business. If it is something that the user is doing, then that's an outcome too. And so part of this idea of outcomes is it's kind of a framework for thinking about, how can we make a change in the world that we can observe, right? So change in behavior is observable, measurable, at least in theory, right? And then is it useful? Is it valuable? Does it help someone, right? And so sometimes I talk about this idea that that outcomes have a point of view. Like what I find valuable as a user might not actually be valuable to you if you're the service provider, right? But you're going to get some value from me if I get some value. So you sort of, what you're doing when you're thinking about outcomes is you're kind of trying to build a model that helps you explain, well, if the user does this and gets value, then the business does this and gets value, right? And you're trying to kind of tell that story in terms of sort of a story of what people are using your product or service to do.
Do you use the term impact? That's what I call the company result. So we got the user or somebody maybe that's more, generally it's a user or customer, like that we're talking about from an outcome standpoint. And then it's generally the company from an impact standpoint. And I always think like outcomes and impacts, if we can get those things as the things in the titles of the thing we're going to work on, like those types of statements, instead of the thing we're going to build or the feature request or whatever it is, like that's a huge leap forward for teams. Do you think about it the same way, or how do you approach that?
A little bit differently. So the framework, and I write about this in the book, but I borrowed and sort of simplified a framework from the nonprofit world. And the framework sort of has, for our conversation, let's say it has 3 levels. So it has output, which is the stuff we make, right? And then it has outcome, which is the behavior change that is like kind of tightly coupled to that thing that we make, right? And then we have impact, and impact is the sort of highest level result. And it's a sort of thing that is like indisputably good and valuable, like profit, revenue, cost reduction, customer loyalty, right? But it's not something where you can draw a straight line and track it and they say, we built a big red button and a user pressed it. Bang, General Electric is profitable. Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like it's too big a leap. And so what happens is like impact is sort of the sum of all of the outcomes, and when we're working on product teams, we need to be working on kind of small, observable, measurable outcomes that may take a long time, or you may never really be able to conclusively prove that they lead to the impact, right? But you need to build that hypothesis, and you need to link it to the things that the impact is the stuff that your most important stakeholders care about. So you need to be able to draw that line, even if you certainly can't prove it in the short term, and you may or may not be able to prove the connection in the long run.
So using, I love having really smart people come on the podcast, because then I just get free coaching and advising from them. But
so well, I'm not sure why you invited me then.
So I think I know what my that was going to come out kind of funny, but I'll say it anyway. I think I know what my problem is for the area that I'm working in right now, and we've been talking a lot about metrics of success for the area, and I'll give you a quick rundown. It's experimentation as a service. So we're working with our enterprise customers who are coming to us, and they want us to do some preliminary research into different areas. So we're talking maybe 12 to 24 months down the road. Like, hey, we're launching a new product. We have our 1-year roadmap set, but maybe we want to start looking at different markets, or maybe going more broader with our product, or maybe deeper and more narrow with our product. But right now we have funding to get this first year up and running, and we want to come to you to do more of a controlled spend. Maybe we want to just invest, let's say $100,000 of spend. We'll contain our risk in that way. And you go deep and narrow in this area, broad, whatever the case happens to be. And so we think of those as just incoming opportunities into our area. And we're trying to think about, like, well, what does success mean to us then? And so far, we're really stuck with activity or throughput metrics. Like, how many of these opportunities can we get through our system? And we're really stuck trying to get to the outcome of it. And I feel like it's because our realm of control it only extends so far. So let me give you an example. Let's just say we want to go deep and narrow into a product that we're running an experiment with, and we find out there is no market there. There's no value proposition for a customer there. We close that out, okay? Like, we can't be judged on success of an experiment because by default, some of our experiments are going to fail, but that's learning and that's valid and that's okay. The other scenario is, kudos, we did this thing, but now it's going on to another team's roadmap that's at least 12 months out from today of when we're going to be working on this thing, and we have no control over how they're actually going to implement that thing that we're working with. And so what I'm kind of curious about your thoughts is, maybe, like I said, I think I know what my problem is, but how could I think about, or how could we think about changing that activity to more of an outcome or output to outcome metrics of success there?
Okay. So I'm gonna make an observation, and maybe this is not true, but I'm gonna make an observation about the story you just told me. Okay, I think that the story you just told me, you were kind of trying to tell me the general case of what this business does, right? You were sort of, in order to simplify it so that I'm hearing it for the first time, this is kind of the general case of the service that we offer to the market, right? And so one of the things about outcomes is it really is about being very, very specific about what people are doing and how you can help them change to do something more easily, better, faster. And so to get to the outcome, we always want to kind of steer away from the general case and to the specific. So my question to you, if we were working together, would be, okay, what are your customers hiring you for? Like, what's the value they get from engaging with you?
I would say the value that we're trying to propose is a fixed risk model. Like I was saying, like, we're only going to invest so much into this. It's like, in fact, Jeff used this last time we were chatting about it, but it's like going to Vegas and knowing that you're only going to gamble $1,000. Like, that's it. Come hell or high water. Worst case scenario, you're walking out with $0 of that $1,000, but hey, you might walk out with 10,000, right? So contained risk, but high reward inside of there,
right?
Would be one of the value props that going after.
So they're coming to you and they want to be able to try an idea and make a fast and safe decision about it. Correct. So I would say that, like, being able to make a good decision is an outcome. Right?
Gotcha. So regardless of whether the decision is maybe kill this experiment because we don't see value in it, or the decision is, yep, we see the ROI or cost of ownership or whatever that might be, and to continue moving forward, it's the ease of being able to make that decision and the confidence in that decision.
Yeah. I would say, I would be looking at something like, okay, well, they hire us for what's an engagement duration?
I would say anywhere from 3 to 6 months.
Okay. And so do you think you can get to a decision? Let's say it's a 3-month engagement. Is it 3 months to get to a decision, or do you have multiple decision points?
I think we want to do an iterative approach to this. So, we build something like a charter, common vision with a high level set of use cases. And then here's our riskiest items that we want to be focusing on first. And then we start to iterate on that, right? We build a prototype out, we test a hypothesis, and then we have a review. So after that first month, I want to give our customers as many opportunities to kill this thing as possible, right?
So your outcome is like, we can make high quality, kill, pivot, persevere decisions at the end of every, iteration, right? Once a month, that's the outcome, right? And so if the service gives us enough information to make high quality, kill, pivot, persevere decisions once a month, the system's doing its job, right? I won't say system, I'll say service, the service that we're providing, right? And so, and then the leading metric would be like, well, we can have a decision meeting, right? We have a decision meeting, right? Well, what do we need for a decision meeting? Well, in order to have a decision meeting, we have to be able to put together a decision presentation, right? That's the behavior, right? And so you keep slicing it down. So my guess would be that it's something like that, right? Right.
Josh, you're worth your weight in gold, my friend. Thank you. That was great.
This conversation got me thinking about the LeanUX canvas in that number 8 section that's way down in the bottom right-hand corner. It's like, what's the least amount of work needed to do to learn the next most important thing? Like, that almost seemed like Jeff's answer. Reframing what you kind of said there, it seemed very similar to me as you were talking.
Yeah. So, I mean, if listeners are not familiar with the LeanUX canvas, it's a tool that there are a lot of Jeffs in this conversation. So, my Jeff is Jeff Gothelf. Jeff and I write about the LeanUX canvas in the book LeanUX, and it's a way of kind of organizing the material you might need for exactly the decision that you're talking about, right? So what's the business problem? What does the outcome for the business look like? Who's the user? What does the outcome look like for the user? What's the product or service that we're creating? What's the feature that we're creating to meet these outcomes? And then what you're talking about is the bottom half of the canvas is what's the risk? What's the hypothesis here? Mm-hmm. What's the risk, and how are we going to test it? Right? What's the last boxes? What's the smallest thing we can do to test our hypothesis? And so yeah, that's the LeanUX canvas. And so this what you're describing is kind of it's near and dear to my heart. This experimental service, right? Because it's both what I write about and what I teach, but also with Jeff and I were founding partners in an agency that we ran from 2012 to 2015 that did product development for clients with exactly this kind of approach, a sort of an eye towards kill, pivot, persevere decisions very quickly. Yeah.
So along those lines, sorry, Jeff, I got one more question I want to throw out there. You're like, damn it, Jeff, shut up. How do you have thoughts around design thinking in particular, and how that ties in with UX, and even just the Lean canvas, or was it the LeanUX canvas? I forget what the actual title of that.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah.
And how those things kind of work together? Are they separate, or just general thoughts from you on design thinking and the canvas?
I think there's design thinking in capital letters, which is kind of a branded approach that IDEO has given us to problem solving, and I think there's kind of the small letter design thinking, which is like how do you approach a problem with a designer's kind of the broadest designer's toolkit, right? Abstracted from the medium. One of the things early in my career, I met a designer at I was living in Palo Alto at the time. I'm sorry. This is. I'll get to your question. I promise you. But I was living in Palo Alto at the time in Silicon Valley, and my kid was in elementary school, first grade, and I went to a parent mixer, and I met this guy. I was working as a user experience designer, and what do you do? What do you do? I asked him, what do you do? He said, I'm an interface designer. I said, cool. That's what I do. I'm an interface designer. And we started talking, and it was very clear, like within 30 seconds, I had no idea what he was talking about. And he didn't have any idea what I was talking about, right? So here we are. We're both interface designers. We don't understand what the F anyone is talking about. And at some point he looks at me and goes, you design user interfaces? I said, yeah. He goes, oh, I design application programming interfaces. I was like, oh, okay, right. So why did I bother telling you that story? There's a million different kinds of designer out there, right? But there's some kind of fundamental approaches. And so, like, for me, that's sort of what design thinking embodies, right? Is we're trying to create something new where nothing existed before. And so I'm, design thinking, I guess, underlies everything I do. And so I think it's very found, in LeanUX, I think it's one of the key kind of foundations to the approach, which is that we can use a designer's kind of toolkit to understand the business, understand the customer, understand the user, and then try and figure out something that's going to be viable and valuable for all of those parties, right? And so yeah, I think it's kind of a kind of a core part of the way I approach problem solving. Now, that was a long story. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did, because I don't want to go into it, but yes, you did, and I think, Jeff, you often articulate it, and I steal this and use it quite often, because you're just smarter than me, but like an outside in versus an inside out perspective when we're thinking about problem solving is really just starting with your customer, starting with your users. What is the problem that you are trying to solve for them, and then working backwards from there. I think that doesn't mean there's not a business element in there. Like, there still has to be value to the business to go out and solve this problem. Otherwise, you're not going to have a business, right? If you just solve problems without thinking about how can we sustain this model, right? But it's starting with your customer, starting with your user, building empathy with them, and then working in towards the business with that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes give the example, like if you went out to market test a service that gave $5 bills to strangers on the street, like that would test really well. It'd be hard to build a business out of it, though.
Yeah. So going back to outcomes, when I'm in the class, I'm teaching that professional Scrum with UX class, and we're going through the case study and we're talking about different examples. It's people are really good at coming up with the how, like the feature they want to build inside of here. And they're really good at coming up with, well, as a company, I just want to be profitable? Like, don't I just want to make a bunch of money? Or whatever that might be, stockholder value or something like that, right? And so, like, I think that's where people like to start. And then the middle part is where people really struggle. Like, how do I define these things? And what makes something a good outcome versus a bad outcome when I'm trying to find that middle ground to connect these dots? So I don't know, maybe you could, like, what would be your answer? Like, what makes something a good outcome versus a bad outcome when you're using it as like a goal for a team to deliver on something?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing is, like, I mean, I just want to acknowledge, like what you said, it's hard, like, to find I think the reason that the book has been successful and popular is that it's not easy to do, right? And it's not common for people to work that way. If it was standard for people to work that way, there'd be no purpose in writing a book, right? And so, I mean, I think about features first pretty much in every project I do. I have a conversation with my colleagues and we get excited. We should do this. Okay, well, I don't know. Should we? Like, should we do that? Like, why should we do it? Like, what do we want out of it? And so, but like, I think that it's really easy to think that way because it's really concrete, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, it's just kind of the natural path of our thinking. And so, but I think the critique is like, okay, well, how do you how do you know that what you're doing is, we're going to build, the example I always give is like, we need a big red button. It just needs to be a big red button on the interface. It's like, okay, why? Like, what are people, how will we know that the big red button is working? Well, we'll know it's working when people click on the big red button. Okay, why would they click on that big red button? And that's really where the question gets interesting, right? And that's how you start to know whether it's a good outcome or a bad outcome. Well, people want to do X, right? People want to, purchase a thing online, so they're going to click the buy now button, right? But people don't want to register on your site. So people are unlikely to click the register button before they've found the thing they want. Or people don't come to your site to sign up for your newsletter. Guess what? Like, if the first thing they see is sign up for the newsletter, like, that's not why. Oh, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to wake up and sign up for 20 newsletters.
Yeah, no one's doing that.
So I think, a good outcome is about understanding, like, it's relative to who the user is and who the customer is, and what they're trying to do, and whether it furthers their pursuit of that goal. And the only way to know that is to engage with other humans.
Yeah, I guess my rule of thumb that I've given people in the past is, like, when you come up with that, red button feature that you want, ask why a few times. And when you get out to, like, because we're going to save a bunch of money, or because we're going to, like, make a lot of money, or we're going to capture a bunch of market share if we do this, back up your whys, maybe one or two more, and that's probably your outcome that you're looking for. And so it's somewhere in the middle there, and it is, I think, to your point, like, it's more of an art than a science. Like, it takes practice, and you got to find the right balance inside of there. Like, you can definitely go too far, and then it's like, I still can't even measure this thing. Or you can back it up, and then it's like, well, you're still at a hypothesis of, like, will this thing get me the underlying value that I'm really looking for from maybe the company's perspective or the user's perspective or whomever we're working towards. So I don't know. Maybe, what are your thoughts? Like, is it more of that art than a science? Like, is there a lot of gray inside of there?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I don't know what the difference between art and science is, but it's not something that where you plug numbers into an equation and you get an answer out. It's not deterministic like that. Yep. It really is like you're dealing with, like, the weirdest, most unpredictable thing that we know how to deal with, which is human behavior. And so why are people doing these crazy things that they're doing? I don't know. What are they trying to do? I don't know. I will tell you one thing, though, which is, and that's, like, I think one of the sort of things that I think is a deep truth about the lean startup movement. And this is, Steve Blank's idea of getting out of the building, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, you can talk about it in a conference room with your colleagues until you're blue in the face, right? And in fact, you probably had all of these arguments with your colleague. You probably stand around the whiteboard and go, no, it's going to be this way. No, it's going to be this way. No, it's going to be this way. It's because you don't actually know. And the answer is not in the conference room. And neither, if you knew, then you wouldn't be having the argument, right? And so the way you know is you get out of the building and you observe people trying to do whatever it is your service is doing, or you talk to people who are trying to do whatever your service is trying to help them do. And so it's very much, like you make a informed guess, you try and make good guesses, but then, you have to go figure out if you were right or wrong. And that's the sort of experiment stuff that we were talking about at the start of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to actually add on to that, two things. One quick observation. I'm so excited that I finally know where Gary Pedretti got his big red button phrase from. It's nice to know who he stole that from, so I can give him crap about that. But the other thing, the more serious thing that you were talking about was that, one, I heard a sense of needing to go and actually observe people in their natural environment and see how they're actually trying to solve the problem. But two, just a sense of humbleness that we're not going to figure it out on a whiteboard sitting in a room. We're going to figure it out by working with users, working with customers in their natural environment, and by testing. And so that's where I want to kind of go with this next question is, I think there's a very easy examples of things we don't need to test. If we are a banking app, we do not need to test authentication to log into the app. Like, you build authentication to get into the app. There is security built into your app. We don't need to test whether or not we want that. Now, different ways of doing that, like Face ID, biometrics, whatever, right? There's a whole slew of interesting ways that we could solve that problem, and maybe we can test in that area. But we still need authentication. Whereas any other type of feature, like we're going to test integrating with ChatGPT and having, AI conversations with customers in real time, whatever the case may be, right? Cool. That sounds like something we should probably do a test with before we start going and rolling that out and trying solving problems with. And in between there are probably a million shades of gray. So what I'm curious about is, how do you kind of have a go-to or a rule of thumb, or how you think about whether or not we should be testing this thing before we start to do anything with it? Like, run before we build anything. Do we have an email campaign where we're just going to test with customers? Would you even be interested in this? Then maybe a paper prototype or a wire prototype, and then maybe whatever, right? And then and that these things build into before you feeling comfortable enough to actually roll it out, A/B test, etc.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of models that I use for this. So the first is kind of prioritizing, right? If you're sitting with your team and you're looking at the work that's ahead of you, one of the things that I think is really important is to have a conversation about which of the let's just say we're going to think about every feature that's on the roadmap, every feature that's in the backlog. We're going to think about all of them as, let's just call every one of them a hypothesis, just for argument's sake, okay? How risky is that hypothesis, right? Have we proven the hypothesis? If we've proven it, we don't have to test it, right? A banking app needs authentication. We've proven that, okay? Mm-hmm. As you said, the method of authentication, there might be some risk in that. Maybe we could differentiate ourselves, but maybe it's not worth it, right? So how risky is it and how valuable is it, right? We're making a banking app. I don't regard the testing, the authentication. The only thing you really need to test is, does it work, right? Does it keep my customers secure? Right? On the other hand, there are other features that are going to be risky because we don't know if they're valuable. We could spend 6 months building them, and because they're very complex. And so if we're wrong, there's a lot of impact for us, right? And so those two dimensions, how risky and how much negative impact if we're wrong, those are the dimensions that I like to have a conversation with my teams about in terms of trying to figure out, what do we test first? Because you can't test everything, right? You just can't. It's stupid. You don't want to try it. And so we want to test the things that are the biggest risk with and most likely to cause us trouble if we get it wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And then obviously what you were talking about is, once you decide to test it, you want to test it with the smallest, fastest investment you can make to learn, right? So if it's a really wacky idea, you start with inexpensive, fast tests. And then once you start to get positive signal, then you kind of progressively invest more money into your tests, or money, time, or more energy, or whatever that is.
You had mentioned in there, and I completely agree with this, like you're never going to have enough time or capacity or whatever to test everything. And there really isn't need to. But part of me even hates asking this question, because I'm sure the answer is going to be, it really depends. But is there almost like a rule of thumb where you're thinking like, hey, on average, we typically end up testing about 30% of the ideas that we go after before we get them into market, or maybe it's more like 70% of ideas before we get them into a customer's hands, or roll out into production, I should say.
Well, I have no idea. I have no idea what that number would look like. I mean, I think, to a certain degree, you're always testing some part of the idea, whether you're testing value, or whether you're testing functionality, or whether you're testing usability, or, it seems to me like there's always plenty, but it may be that on any specific feature, you're testing it in the context of some other thing that you're testing, right? So it may not be the focus, but you're open to learning about it, and you're open to reconsidering it if it was kind of a low risk feature and a moderate value feature. You put it out in the world, you see if it works, and you have to have this willingness to go back and iterate if you're learning that it's something's not working.
Yeah, I think that I kept going back to thinking that hypothesis prioritization canvas thing. Like I feel like that's what you've been describing here, Josh.
Yes, exactly. There's a canvas for everything.
Yeah, you got a canvas for everything. It's like just a 4-quadrant, like because every good consultant's got a 4-quadrant for everything.
I was literally thinking that. I was like, he's just pulling out the 2x2,
and it's just low risk over here, high risk over here, high value here, low value here, right, up and down. And so then there's just the 4 quadrants. So that's what I think we've described here. So I think that's what I look at. I actually that was a question last week when I was teaching at PSUs. Somebody was like, in our company, we create a lean canvas for every single, I don't know, in their world, it was called an epic, that comes through. And it's like it just takes a lot of time, and I'm like, well, why? Tell me more about this. And we got into it, and come to find out, these are just more like features. Each of them has a thing, and it's like authentication would be something they create a lean canvas for. And I'm like, do you really need that? Don't you just want to just build that? You kind of just know what it is. So we had this whole conversation about when not to do that. And then the rules of thumb, and then you got to find out the middle part, right? And if you are going to do it, maybe the things on the left and the right, those business, of the lean canvas, they're probably going to stay static a lot of the time. You shouldn't be reinventing the wheel, but that solutions and then the assumptions and then how you're going to test those, especially in your riskier items that are high value, you're going to probably fill those out, but not so much on the, the authentication type ones that are we just got to do these things and we've done it before. Just do it,
Yeah. No. I mean, I always say, it's weird, I certainly think LeanUX is a valuable way to approach product development, but it's not the only way, right? And it's not appropriate for every situation. And we'll keep talking about authentication because it's fine as a placeholder for kind of low risk, must have functionality, right? Low risk, must have functionality. You just want to build it quickly, efficiently, with high quality. There's not uncertainty here. And so the thing about Eric Ries in the Lean Startup, he always said his thing is that he got a lot of grief, I think, for the name Lean Startup. And so he sort of stepped back and he said a startup is a human, I think he said it's a human endeavor that's trying to create something new in conditions of extreme uncertainty. And that's where that extreme conditions of extreme uncertainty, that's really where this lean approach is valuable, right? And so if we've got relatively high certainty that something's going to work, just do it, Yeah. So.
Sorry, real quick, I had to hit the mute button. The one thing I wanted to add real quickly, though, was going back to that sense of humbleness. I feel like if we err on the side of something, it's generally the arrogant side where, of course this will work, right? Of course our customers will buy this.
I've been in this industry for 25 years. Of course this is what the users want. And it's,
Well, and so that's hard. And it's hard to, for me, that conversation is, okay, well, look, we think this is going to work, but what are we worried about? We worry we can't build it fast enough. It's going to be great, but we can't build it fast enough. Okay, so maybe it's overscoped. What's the smallest unit of value here, right? What's the smallest thing we could build? Do we know? Is that too big, too small? How do we know? So there's always a question, right? Yep. And so to me, that's the... having spent a bunch of time doing consulting, you can't really go to the boss or the client and go well, that's a terrible idea, boss, client, right? That's never going to work, right? And so, but what you can say is, what are you worried about, right? What keeps you up at night? What are you uncertain about? Where are the risks? Because, I, your faithful servant, am here to de-risk this initiative, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's another way in to without shaking the team's confidence, right? Or without challenging anybody's authority, to kind of have conversations about where the uncertainty is in any initiative,
Yeah, the risk, or I think I've asked the question too, what's the scariest thing about this product that we're building right now, or something like that, right? That, right. That kind of gets people in that same frame of mind. And then, yeah, what's the smallest thing we can do to solve that problem? And how would we measure it if we were successful? And then what's the smallest thing we could do to get towards that? So it's interesting when you start doing that, because like creative things come up. I'll just tell a quick story. I was on a team one time, and we were tasked for coming into this company and building something that was going to get them away from mailing these claims out to whoever they had to mail them to. And fax them. Now, this wasn't that long ago, but they wanted to fax. Okay, so that's fine. Whatever they wanted to fax. So, one step forward, I guess. But they're going to save like $12,000 a day once we put this in place. And we started building some stuff, and we thought, we got to build a UI, and we got to talk to the users, and we got to do all this like stuff, and all great ideas. And then we had to like stop and think like it's $12,000 a day. Like every day we spend doing this, they're losing $12,000. Like that's a lot of money. And so like, what is the smallest thing we can actually build to do this? And I'm like, well, I mean, they get these huge files, and we could write something to split those files, put them into these like Windows Explorers folders. They can move them into the folders where they want the different things to happen. And then we could have a service that picks them up and does what we want them to do and send them to the fax server. They already got a fax server set up. Like, we could probably do that in a sprint. Okay, let's do it. So we did it in a sprint, put it out there, and realized the fax server couldn't handle it, which was a great thing that we learned, because then we didn't build it all out right away without learning it. And so there's these other technical problems we had to figure out after that. But we learned that really, really quick, and they started saving money much faster, because we just like, what's the fastest way we can get these things to be faxed instead of mailed? That was the goal, not build out the long-term solution of what they're going to have for the next 2 decades,
Yeah, I love that, and it's I think that's like one of the things that I find really appealing about the sort of agile mindset is exactly those stories. Like, wait a minute, like, can we really think creatively about how we're solving this problem, and using that discipline of like, what's the smallest valuable thing we could deliver here, and and so that's a great story. Yeah.
So I got a new topic for us to bring up if we have a few more minutes, but maybe we'll get through it, maybe we won't. But roadmaps, love them, hate them. Tell me what your thoughts are, Josh.
Well, I mean, not surprisingly, I think that there's a use for outcomes in roadmaps.
Yeah.
And that, typically sort of the work that I do with my clients is to when we're looking at roadmaps, it's, I would say one of the properties of outcomes is you don't get them you don't know that you've gotten them by shipping software, right? That's the sort of challenge with Agile is we get to done and we put it in the world, okay? But we need actually another kind of milestone in our Agile processes or methodologies, which is we need done, but we also need validated. And so validated means we've put it in the world and we've observed it and it's working, right? And so not just working from a technical point of view, like passes tests, but actually creating the outcome, the change in user behavior or customer behavior that we want. And so that takes time. It's just like, done is like, okay, well, we can get to done every 2 weeks because we're good at this, You can't get to validated on that same kind of predictable schedule. It's just not a problem that has a predictable tempo. And so validated takes as long as it's going to take. And so typically, like, getting to validated is something that you might work on for a quarter, or you might work on for a couple of quarters. And so you can use these outcomes and you can ship feature after feature after feature to try and drive this outcome. But you might do that over the course of a quarter. And so outcomes can be sort of an organizing principle for your roadmap, right? And so you can say something like, well, in Q1, as a product group, we're really interested in driving repeat use, right? And so we have a number. Repeat use means our customers visit our site, X number of times in Y period. That's what repeat use means. And so everything we're doing is about driving repeat use. That's the outcome that we're seeking. And so team A, team B, team C, what are the features that you believe are going to drive repeat use? Those are the ones that go on the roadmap this quarter. The other ones, okay, those are interesting. Or the other ones, those are like maintenance. We've got to do them, fine, right? But the things that get elevated each quarter are the features that we believe are driving the outcomes. And the interesting thing about this is we don't know if any given feature is going to create the outcome. So the thing that we make our commitment to when we're doing an outcome-based roadmap is not that we will deliver the feature, but that we will drive the outcome by trying feature after feature after feature until we get there, right? So it might be that one team is the content team, and they're going to work on seeing what content is going to be the most sticky, and another team is going to be the coupon team, and they're going to whatever. So so that was kind of a long way of saying that, like, that for me, like, one of the really valuable things to add to roadmaps is outcomes as an orienting idea. And then the sort of what comes from that is this idea that it ain't about committing to features. It's about committing to outcomes.
Yep. And I think the core problem with like the feature-based roadmaps that have like times on them is that it's almost like the old manufacturing mindset that I think you even referenced in the book, right? Where it's like, well, what do I want? I want more of the things and I want them faster. Like that's how I get more value out the door for my organization. And that's not it at all. It's like when you focus people around the outcome, like this is the value we want to provide to this group of people, then it's like, well, what's the least amount of work we have to do that? Okay, then let's stop, right? Like we never stop when we just get into the feature request feature factories, type of organizations.
Jeff tells a good story that I think illustrates this well about. So Jeff Gothelf was he worked at a site called The Ladders, which was a recruiting site, and so it had job seekers and the like key constituents on the site, job seekers, and there were recruiters on the site. And so at some point, he was working on a team, and they were given an outcome to drive, and they had looked into the numbers on the site. And one of the things they discovered was that when job seekers and recruiters sent messages to one another, it was a predictor of good things. So the more messaging that was going on between the job seekers and the recruiters, the more successful the job seekers were, the more successful the recruiters were, the more successful the site was. So they were told, like, okay, the number is in the 20%, right? You all drive that number over the next quarter, drive it to 75%, right? I don't know what this is a measure of. It's some communication rate, right? And so the team started working on it. They were working on the rate. They were not working on features. And so then they sat down and they were like, well, what features could we come up with that might do this? And they tried some things that worked and they tried some things that didn't work. And at the end of the quarter, they'd gone from like the 20s to the high 30s. And stakeholders were pleased and they were like, keep going for another quarter. And they went for another quarter and they went from high 30s to high 60s. And the stakeholders were like, okay, well, you didn't get to 75, but that was great. Like you really drove that number. That's good. We're going to put you on the next problem. Right. And so I think that's like a really good example of how like outcomes and roadmaps can kind of play together. Right. Is that this is what this team is working on: recruiter, job seeker communication, and don't talk to me about features.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know. Then when someone from the technical standpoint says, well, why do we have to measure user behaviors? And like, why do we have to have that analytics? It's like, because we're trying to solve the goal. And how will we know if we're even coming close if we can't track what's actually happening when we put this thing in the wild? So I think that's an important thing because not enough applications have that.
I mean, I think, one of the things that I think is a step in the right direction as an industry is that certainly in modern SaaS businesses, nobody asks that question anymore. Why do we have to track user behavior? I think you still see that question coming up a lot, but it's starting to gain kind of broad acceptance, I think.
Yeah, I think for the most part there it does. It's probably just because a lot of the organizations I work with have some of these legacy products, and I know Jeff wanted to get in some legacy questions, and it's like, how do you add that into legacy? And I don't know, my advice always is like, well, you got to start somewhere, so just like do one little bit, one little piece, just to get started somewhere, because something's better than nothing, and then we'll figure out what we need after that. I don't know, Jeff, you kind of want to jump.
Yeah, if you don't mind, that's probably like a perfect segue. So, just what I was kind of curious about was to get your thoughts on, you're in there as a product coach, you're in there helping coach with experimentation, and they're talking about feature X, and they're talking about it with the team, and all of a sudden there's the big sigh. You're like, oh, what's going on? And they're like, that touches the AS400, and you know what that means, right? And so how. But when you're dealing with those legacy systems, what's your approach? What are things that you try and keep in mind, and what are the things that you try and coach teams to be thinking about when they're working with some of that maybe a little bit outdated technology? I don't want to pick on them too much, but older technology, if you will.
Those poor AS400 people. One of the first designer I worked for was a guy named Alan Cooper. Alan's a great guy, and I think a really important thinker in the sort of bringing design to software. He wrote a great book called "The Inmates Are Running the Asylum," about sort of the way software was being designed at the time, and he talks about this idea of sort of implementation model versus mental model, right? And so the way the user conceives of a task, right, versus the way it gets implemented in the system. And certainly in those days, you still see applications where you interact, you feel like you're interacting with raw database tables. Mm-hmm. You click, there's like a row of data, and you double click on an item in the row and it pulls up another table. Maybe it even pops up in another window, and then you have like windows after windows after windows of data tables, right? That's because the system stores the data in relational database in a table, right? And so the user interface then replicates the implementation model. And so a lot of what happens when we're dealing with the legacy system constraints is the implementation models being forced into the user's space, into the user experience, right? And so, well, we handle the data this way, and we can't put this data and this data on the screen together because that's, two different queries, and the system has to produce them sequentially or whatever that is, right? But people have this very different idea. And so I think, like, for me, there's the thing I'm always trying to do when I get faced with legacy constraints is like obviously there's a whole conversation about migrating away from legacy systems and how you do that. But like most of the time, that conversation is off limits, right? Like nobody touches that system because Bob's the only one who knows how it works. And Bob is 6 days from retirement, and we don't want to bother him, And so then the question is, what can we put on top of that legacy data to make it conform more to the way the user and the customer are thinking about the problem, right? And so that's always, you're hearing kind of my design background in there, but it's always what is the customer's point of view, right? How do they conceive of this task, right? How do they think of the data? They don't think about it as a customer table and a record locator table and a blah, blah, blah. They think about it as an invoice or something like that. And so what can I do in some middleware that we might have to create to deal with the nasty old system and create some new object or something that feels human, That's kind of that may be a little bit of an it depends answer, but that's sort of my approach, right? Is okay, I get it. That's how that system works, but that's how this system, the human system, also has its constraints. So
Cool. That's helpful. I'm going to quick, Jeff, if you don't mind, jump in and quick get this last one knocked out, because just so we don't hit our time box. But I pull up in my notes here. All right. So if you have any general thoughts on ways LeanUX effectively works within an Agile delivery model.
yeah. So I think I could answer that question by saying, how does Agile work within a product discovery model? Right. I mean, like the idea that LeanUX has to conform to an Agile delivery model doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because remember we were talking before that the whole point of LeanUX is that we're operating in a system of extreme uncertainty, right? And so our priority is not deliver. Our priority is figure out together as a team what works, right? And so sometimes we do that by sending researchers out into the field to study for a couple of years, right? But mostly that's not what we do, right? Mostly we have product people and designers and engineers who are working together in the same room trying to figure out what's the most effective thing to put in our customers' and users' hands, right? And so this notion of, when I started, this thing we now called product discovery, right? We used to call it design research, and everybody hated it, right? The designers were defensive about it, and everybody thought the designers were just being self-indulgent, right? But I think product discovery is a much better framing, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out what product to deliver, right? But the question, like, how does LeanUX fit into an Agile delivery model? That sort of assumes that we know what to deliver, right? And so delivery is part of it. We have to be good at delivering, but we have to figure out what to deliver. And so I think that's the work of the whole team. And I think that's sort of the sort of starting point for LeanUX, is that LeanUX is the work of the whole team. It's not something that designers go off and do. It's not something that product people go off and do. But it's asking this question: what are we sure about? What are we not sure about? And what's the smallest thing we can do to start delivering value and to test our ideas? And the story, Jeff, that you told about the system that was interfacing with the fax server, that wasn't design research or product research. That was the team figuring out the smallest thing to do that could be effective, right? And so to me, like, that's the answer is so. And so I kind of rejected your question, but I think that's the answer, right? Is like it is the work,
Yeah, I would say some mature Agile delivery teams, like, there is no difference between like product discovery and the delivery like organization. Like, they just are one and the same.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest gaps that's out there, actually. Barry and Christian, two other PSTs that are the Liberators over in the Netherlands, they have this like Scrum team survey thing that they do, and they've got thousands of people that have gone through gone through it, and of teams. And the one thing that's one of the most common things that people are really bad at is product discovery. Like, it's one of the most common things that Scrum teams are bad at, and they don't have ownership over, and that's probably leads to like them feeling like, feature factories and all the many of the anti-patterns we talk about. And I think that
there's so much cultural baggage too in our organizations about, who gets to participate in product discovery and what product discovery is, and well, we've got these engineers and they're very expensive. So they've got to be making the ones and zeros all day long, I think that, there are a lot of that's just one of the stereotypes that we're up against, and so I think there's hopefully we'll see that change.
Yeah, what I was going to chime in with is one of the things I was hearing when you were rejecting that question was, one of those anti-patterns, and Jeff was talking about, I'm just iterating it slightly differently, is that Agile is just for delivery. Like, and in fact, the solutions are being given to us. We just have to build them. And then like all of this dysfunction that comes out of that stuff that the two of you were just kind of talking through. When we talk about going a little bit deep here, but when we talk about Scrum, versus traditional waterfall development, you've got your design, analysis, build, integrate, deploy, like all of those phase gates throughout there. We often articulate, well, Scrum is, you can do all of that within a 30-day sprint. You're just doing it when it's necessary to do that. You're just doing a little bit of all of that stuff all the time. And what I would and to that is, well, that's agility. You're doing your product discovery and your product delivery a little bit all the time, and you're just iteratively going after that when you're picking the right problems to be solving.
Yeah, I mean, we're singing from the same prayer book here, and I think hopefully, one of the big challenges that I think we face is that Agile often gets brought into the organization by the engineering department, right? And it's sort of it works within existing silos.
Yeah.
So the discovery work is already siloed. Like before Agile was there, right?
Yep.
Discovery work is done over here, and then it gets handed off to these people who, oh, by the way, you all are doing Agile, fine, whatever.
Yep.
Right. And so, hopefully we'll start to see some of that breaking down.
Yep. That is one of the biggest problems, I think, with, Agile implementations is they just put it over the top of existing systems and expect it to do something magical. And it's like, you're just using different vocabulary at this point. You have to make a bigger change, and that's working differently. That's behaviors, it's principles. Like, there's a lot that goes into that. So I know. I feel like we're all saying the same thing. I think
we've come to the end of the controversy here.
Yeah. I think someday when people just call themselves product developers instead of like designers and front-end developers and back-end developers and whatever else, we're just product developers and we're all on one team. We all have one title and we build products. That's what we do. They identify solving business problems, not as like the thing they do, the activities they do, the outcome. They identify more on the impact they make for the organization and for people. Then maybe we'll know that they will, like, this is actually working, and like they're.
Well, I'm going to push back, Jeff. I think that's a beautiful dream. But no, the reality is like people have different skill sets, and so I think you also need to honor that, and so like, I'm like if I'm on a product team, I'm a valuable part of that product team, but I'm only good at some of that work. And there's definitely stuff you don't want me doing. I don't want me doing, they don't want me doing, you don't want me doing. But I'm really good at other parts of the work. And I think being able to bring together a team of people and to work collaboratively in a way that says like, look, Jeff is really good at this thing and he can be in the same room as Josh, who's really not good at it, but he's really good at this other thing, right? Like, that's actually, it's a hard problem because we come from different professional cultures or we've got different professional values. And that's a hard problem to solve, but I think it's the right problem, right? Where we're like honoring the differences on our team and like turning that into an asset,
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I guess I wasn't thinking not honoring that. I was thinking more just like the reason we exist is to solve some type of problem in the world. And we should identify around that and align around that. Not the reason we exist is to produce code or artifacts or something like that,
Yeah. Well, yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Cool. Well, this has been a great conversation, Josh. Really, really appreciate your time. I guess at this point, is there anything you want to plug to our listeners?
Is there anything? So no, I'm not going to plug anything. I appreciate that. Thank you. Follow me on what's left of Twitter and LinkedIn, and you'll see some announcements coming from me in the first part of the year. So that'll be cool.
Thank you for listening to the Agile Wire. We are consistently inspecting and adapting ourselves. We would appreciate feedback at feedback@theagilewire.com or on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play Store. See you next time.